Is the US government really teaming up with Elon Musk's brand new DOGE task force? And what does it mean for your finances if you're living abroad or thinking about living abroad? In this video, John McNerney and I break down 3 shocking scenarios for Americans under the new administration. Ready to find out if your money and your move overseas are safe? Let's dive in. Since January 20th, there have been a lot of changes that have happened both politically and in the markets. John, we really need to dig in to find out how we can advise people or clear up some of the things that are happening in the market and hopefully guide them in the right direction. So tell us, what has happened since that day in January 2025?
The new administration, the Trump and JD Vance administration, has come in and tried to make some sweeping changes. I think the most change that's ever been attempted. They're just trying to remake a lot of the government infrastructure. And in doing that, the Department of Government Efficiency, or the DOGE, and Elon Musk to assist them with a broad swath of cost-cutting measures. And a lot of that is aimed at sort of gutting these government infrastructure elements. And so they're just basically firing lots of folks. There was an email that went out, the email that Elon Musk sent to the Twitter employees when he came into Twitter, to all government employees, regardless of their department, offering to buy them out and lay them off voluntarily, so that we could just immediately come in and just cut just a ton of cost. And so that's probably the most significant element of what's gone on so far. And again, we're dealing with limited information, but there are a number of government agencies that are just being phased out very quickly. Elon and the Department of Government Efficiency was specifically brought into government by the Trump administration to cut all kinds of costs. That is, I think, relevant because the government's role in finances is front and center. It's the regulator for the financial markets. It makes the markets move smoothly. It corresponds with the Federal Reserve, with the head of the Treasury, Jay Powell, that sort of works with the executive branch and with Congress to ensure that there's a grown-up in the room, for lack of a better way to put it, so that things can function smoothly. When you think about the government as a regulatory entity, having parts of it be just broken up quickly could introduce a lot of issues. It could unleash a number of consequences that we need to be very mindful of. I don't think that we have to be super worried, although it is concerning, the rate of change that's being forced into the system. And so that's what I think is our job to talk about. And then talking about expatriates, oh my goodness, like we are already talking to a group of people who may have bias on this issue. So do we worry about portability of money, about how it affects, maybe your retirement savings? Because I know that we have a lot of folks that are able to expatriate that are retiring. Yeah, we get concerned. We start to think about whether there's going to be some serious consequences.
Would this even bleed into things like the foreign exchange rate? Because right now we're sitting at an average high. Typically, we trade at kind of a wider gap where the dollar isn't as close to parity to the euro. Should people be concerned about this?
That is such an interesting point. It's actually going to strengthen the dollar for a period of time. So whenever we enact a tariff on goods that are coming into the country, then that is inherently better for the domestic production of goods. So people that are producing goods from within the country are going to be at a slight advantage, or at an advantage to the extent that tariffs are being put on to the import of foreign goods. So that is actually going to increase the value of dollars. It makes it more difficult to do foreign trade. But anyways, as far as the dollar is concerned, it will have a strengthening effect on the dollar as long as there are not downstream consequences that make the U.S. economy less strong.
Worse off.
Yeah. So if the U.S. economy weakens, then that could have some problems, but that's going to be later. It's a consequential effect that is, at this point, still speculative.
You have 3 potential scenarios that you'd like to share with our audience about what could happen or what will happen during this administration change. What are those 3 scenarios? What should we know about these things?
So the first is there's like a full-scale backlash against this slate of change that's being promoted, down to hybrid of acceptance / pushback. And then there's like a third last scenario where we have sort of like, this is the other end of the spectrum. There's like a full-on change to a different style of government altogether. How far will things change? It's more the system and all of the regulatory framework, the people within it pushing back and saying, hold on now, we're going to have legal challenges to the dissolution of various departments within the government. We're going to see different policies that the Trump administration, as well as the DOGE, we're going to see sort of people trying to reverse a lot of these policies coming in. Basically, we're going to see the incoming administration being stymied and being pushed back on. And that's not awesome, just for the simple fact that it's just going to be a bunch of just choking in every direction. There'll be a lot of social unrest as a consequence of all of these scenarios. But in this backlash scenario, you'll see just a lot of unrest, and it will make us look like the gang that couldn't shoot straight as a country. Everything is just going to look like chaos. I'm talking about a house sort of divided against itself completely. Yeah, I mean, all of this is going to impact it. I think in Europe, there is this tendency for Europeans to sort of sometimes they have a little cheeky schadenfreude about what's happening in the US. But it's probably going to be also accompanied with a sense of relief because it will mean that business as usual will gradually reassert itself as the incoming administration's policies don't find their target and things don't get sliced up and diced up. So it'll just be an expensive experiment.
How long do you suspect that this kind of experiment would last?
Well, we're probably going to know until the midterm elections. There is always this sort of initial period during every new presidency where the incoming administration can get everything that they want. There's going to be conflict. The Republicans enjoy a solid majority right now. And until there is any chance for critical response, which would be the midterm elections, we're going to see this initial phase be just lots of change and mostly uncontested in the sense that the Republican majorities will give the administration fuel that it needs.
Okay, so in this scenario A, where it's full-scale backlash, what are some of the market reactions to this that could impact people moving?
Well, this will probably be less impactful for folks that are moving or living abroad. It will basically mean total gridlock. So total gridlock means that the rate of change will slow down to a crawl. And so they'll probably just need to deal with more the social element of it, of people thinking that we're kind of dumb.
Right.
But this scenario represents the least amount of actual change.
I feel like we deal with that anyways. People think we're kind of dumb. So
yeah, people do. They do. They don't see us as inherently just better. That's all from within. That's what we oftentimes bring to the world.
Okay. Is there anything else that we need to know about scenario A before we move on to scenario B?
I think scenario A is depending upon your stance on the political spectrum. Let's just face it, a lot of folks that are moving to Portugal, especially, are moving to a socialist environment. They're probably going to prefer this scenario of the three that we might consider because this is more business as usual. It's a highly inefficient scenario, but it is the least impactful. Scenario B, if we're looking at like the spectrum of changes, is sort of like, the medication works. If the medication was something that we wanted, it works, but it's not a wholesale change. Some people might even prefer scenario B if they're of the mind that the incoming administration has got a point. Like a lot of people do believe that the Trump administration is coming from a place of some reason, that the government does have a lot of inefficiency. There is a lot of exploitation that's occurring from within because special interest groups have gotten into bed with these agencies. And so scenario B is where you have this legislative pushback that occurs, just like scenario A, but that pushback actually causes the current administration's agenda to become partially enacted. I think that this would be sort of a healthy response in a way, because if you buy that the incoming agenda has some validity to it, you will see only the most agreed upon aspects of their agenda be enacted. There are some sort of easy targets, we'll call them, that the administration has already taken down. Some might say that that is the dry brush that's been cleared out. Maybe that was to the good. But we won't see the government going just like full bore, sort of hollowing out most of the institutions. How does that affect us, especially if we're moving abroad? This is probably the best scenario from the sense that we will be seen as sort of following through on things that we believe that need to happen as a government. This is the sort of checks and balances situation where you see the executive branch taking full advantage of its mandate and its privilege to make all these changes. This is the most probable scenario, by the way, is that the government will do what it seems intent on doing right now. It will slash a lot of things up. But the economic impact, we will maybe get a little bit of a leaner cost structure within the government. So it should be said that all of these scenarios, once again, their impact will only be felt in the fullness of time. If there is indeed some massive cost cutting, then it will over time have a positive impact. And so for individuals that are retired, maybe that means that Social Security is restored to a more solvent path. The downside, of course, is that governmental entities that are a net positive are going to be eliminated. It could be social consequences. But on the financial side of things,
Okay.
I don't think that it hurts as much. And if you're moving abroad, maybe those social consequences don't even really affect you anyways.
That clears quite a bit up. I feel like I grew up in a generation where our parents continued to tell us that Social Security wasn't going to be a thing by the time I got to retirement age. Is that the current trend? And is this something that could reverse that?
That's an awesome point. As a financial planner, all of our financial plans that we create for people assume that Social Security will be there, when in fact we've been told that it will, in fact, run out of money. At its current rate of spending, it's actually out of money now, and it's
Mm,
actually alive on IOUs. That should be of grave concern to us all. But here's the positive thing that they tell us. They said, okay, well, don't worry. Once the fund runs out of money, we're going to continue to pay out on the promises of Social Security from actual tax revenues. And I don't think that that's a huge win. That's sort of
mm.
telling everybody that we're going to be living hand to mouth in the Social Security fund. And that's scary. So, what all of this is aimed at is at restoring solvency to so much of our current entitlements programs. So, when your
Okay.
debt service and your retirement plan are like the most expensive aspects of your budget, like that's problematic. That is actually the sense with which all of this has been put to work, is to try and
Okay.
strip out all of that fat. And so theoretically, at least, this could go a long ways towards actually restoring some balance. You're going to have a lot of people that say this is exactly what the political process was designed to do: allow for change, but to give us a chance to digest it and to have some critical response.
And to reiterate, you said that this was the most likely outcome as well.
On the order of these three scenarios, I think this is the likeliest that we will see. I am not trying to feed any kind of internet fear mongering. There's no fear mongering.
Yes.
So, this is just a scenario in which maybe the government decides to take its premise all the way. The administration comes in and gets everything that they want, and the things that they want start bearing some early signs of success. We see that, like, the forms of regulation industries that are heavily regulated right now have like a burst of speed put onto them, and everybody's excited. Our trade tariffs have the intended effect completely. We see like this resurgent domestic manufacturing. That might in turn cause the government to go even further with the programs that it's currently introduced. And that's why we call it DOGE dominance. We see Elon Musk brought even higher into sort of key decision making arenas and allowed to establish a sort of, my partner calls it technocratic order. I have to expose my bias. I find this a little scary. This is a
Okay.
scenario in which we see a curbing of democracy as we know it. You might have term limits removed, for example, and you might have like DOGE elevated to a position where they oversee the Treasury. There might be a rollback of the autonomy of the Fed that's been talked about by Donald Trump and his administration. He's thinking, why don't we just sort of streamline things and allow the executive branch to have direct monetary control? That whole scenario scares the dickens out of me.
I think a
Um,
lot of people.
I think a lot of people get scared when they
Mm,
look at that. It
mm.
just really starts to make the United States look like countries that we don't tend to want to be like. So that scenario would look highly jubilant, probably, especially the wealthy would grow even wealthier, but like it would exacerbate the effects of income inequality that we're already seeing, because all of our sort of technocratic leaders would become sort of de facto oligarchs. A lot of people think
Okay.
of this as like the oligarch scenario. The streamlining would leave an even smaller minority of highly wealthy individuals in charge, and they would be in charge for life, and there would be a lack of social mobility. This would be terrible, to be honest,
Would
because long term it would destroy the dollar. The world relies on us to play kind of an open game, and this would shut that down, and ultimately we think create a severe decline in US influence in the world.
So earlier you mentioned there would be a weakening of the dollar. How would a weakening of the dollar impact people that are already living abroad or considering this move?
Oh my goodness. Well, if the individual in question had all of their money in the United States, then for sure that currency being weakened would immediately reduce our spending power in the rest of the world. This is a public service announcement to you. If you don't vote or participate in the political process at all, then I'm sorry, but you gotta. So even if you're not living in the United States, if you're a registered citizen, you can and should still vote, because if you don't want any of these scenarios to happen, but you don't vote, then sorry, but you're kind of part of the problem on that. Like,
Mm.
we all have to participate in this very public debate. It's not the evil men that cause the world to become a worse place. It's when good people don't act. That's the final thing here. Is it's just because you want to move to another country doesn't mean that you bow out of the conversation altogether. There is not really any evidence to support the idea that long-term rates of return on any asset class will be radically different. It just needs to be said that all of these scenarios are sort of speculative and all outside of the known world. I have to say, consult with a professional and really think about what all this means. It's a fairly rigorous subject that you should really think about. If you think that this situation is going to get out of hand in any way whatsoever, you need to sort of back away slowly from the higher risk categories of investments. So higher risk being investments in US stocks, and then all the way down to cash being the most boring, most predictable asset. But because we're talking in an environment where a lot of people are cross-border, diversify your cash as well. So
Yeah,
don't earn
you've got to buy other currencies.
yeah,
Yeah.
you got to have other currencies, up to and including having a little bit of cryptocurrency, up to and including having some gold. Get your emergency fund built. Have at least a year's worth of funds, maybe in a multi-currency situation, set to the side so that you don't have to worry about the situation getting completely out of hand.
What currencies do you recommend that people should have?
Where you live is where you should have your emergency fund. Like if you live in Europe, you need to have euros. And you have to think about how liquid that currency is. That's number one. Number two, then you look at where you can get the most stable rate of return and in a well-regulated environment. There's countries who have horrible track records for being easily accessible, and sometimes they put capital controls on their money. Argentina has had a really bad track record. They have
Okay.
nationalized their money many times. For the most part, it's the US dollar. The US
Okay.
dollar at this moment in time is the world's reserve currency for a reason. It's been the
Hmm.
most stable currency. We actually own and operate a real asset portfolio that includes precious metals. So that's like an asset class. And we always have around 5% at any given moment. If you have the means to, it might not hurt to have a little bit of gold for yourself. But yeah, and then cryptocurrencies. A lot of people say that that's maybe sort of like the third wheel of currency that's evolving.
Let me ask you about real estate because you've not touched on real estate.
Yeah, real estate is central. You should have real estate in your portfolio. First of all, the one that you live in, so that
Okay.
you could nail down your shelter cost, as they call it.
Hmm.
Some people believe that you should just rent till the end because you get higher rates of return on all the other asset classes. I'm not one of those. I think human
Okay.
nature being what it is, I think you should own your primary residence. And then there are some folks who become the monopoly guy. If you are a professional with real estate and you can operate properly on leverage and
Mm.
be a great landlord, it
Yeah.
can be highly lucrative. And it also stabilizes your income because you don't have to count on withdrawing funds or the stock markets. So
Right.
if you have real estate, it could be amazing. It's a whole other thing. Like, because if you
Hmm.
move to Portugal, as we've talked about, and you
Hmm.
have income coming to you in Portugal, you've got a whole other set of issues like taxes that you have to think about. Well, first off, make sure you have your emergency fund. Make sure you have
Okay.
like a year's worth
Build
of
it
living
first.
expenses. Exactly. That's your base. Know your living situation is secure. So own your home that you live in, and then keep your investments in a reasonable portfolio. Make sure that you have your cash available and that it's in the country that you live in. I think you should be
Okay.
reasonable, and you should just keep everything like really balanced.
Ready to dig deeper? John has a fourth scenario, scenario X, he couldn't fully reveal here. If you want all the details, check out our unedited podcast by clicking on the screen or in the description below. Or better yet, book a free 15-minute call with John to discuss your finances one-on-one. Don't wait until it's too late. Your future abroad depends on it. Now, let's get moving.